What do you mean?
Now, I've done things on the military-industrial complex and mercenaries, and it was only really a matter of time before I was going to do a video on war crimes. I'll go through a list of declarations, conventions, treaties, and judgments on the laws of war, and I got most of my information from treaties.un.org or the ICRC.org, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Very helpful. I'll have the links below. But I won't read all of them. 1864, Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the conditions for the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field. 1899, Hague Conventions. It consisted of 3 main sections and 3 additional declarations. 1. Pacific settlement of international disputes. 2. Laws and customs of war on land. 3. Adaptation to maritime warfare for principles of Geneva Convention of 1864. Declaration 1. On the launching of projectiles and explosives from balloons. Declaration 2. On the use of projectiles of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. Declaration 3. On the use of bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body. Hectic. 1925. Geneva Protocol for the prohibition of the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases or of bacteriological methods of warfare. 1929. Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Because you now see World War I's happened. Geneva Convention on the amelioration of the conditions of the wounded and sick. 1938. League of Nations Declaration for the protection of civilian populations against bombing from the air in case of war. 1947. Nuremberg Principles formulated under the UN General Assembly Resolution 177. And that's the human race trying to learn from World War II. 1948. United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide. Oh yeah, see? This is when the Geneva Conventions that seem to be the ones that people seem to think of most, which is 1. The amelioration for the condition for the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field, and the second one is amelioration for the conditions of the wounded and sick and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. And number 3, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and number 4 is relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. 1954, Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. 1974, Declaration on the protection of women and children in emergency and armed conflict. They finally got to it. 1977, this is when a bunch of protocols that now come with the Geneva Conventions 1, 2, 3, and 4, which the Geneva Protocol 1, additional to the Geneva Conventions of 12th of August 1949, and relating to the protection for victims of international armed conflict, and the second one is for the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. And I believe the third one is pretty much making the symbol, the Red Cross symbol, the international known symbol for medics and cannot be targeted, which makes the Red Cross a fairly unique organization. That reminds me I should go donate blood. Anyway, 1980, Protocol on prohibitions or restrictions on the use of incendiary weapons. So just like weapons that are designed to catch fire. 1995, so I'm alive now. Protocol on blinding laser weapons. Yeah, sounds like fun. 1996, amended Protocol on the prohibition or restriction on the use of mines, booby traps, and other devices. International Court of Justice advisory option. Legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. 2000. See, just the first word is already like, what? Optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflicts. Yeah, okay. And 2008, Convention on Cluster Munition. Rome Statute from 1998, which was then enforced in 2002. And this statute was the one that established the International Criminal Court, and their purpose is purely to prosecute people who are guilty of the following crimes: the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. And yes, I'm gonna read out all the relevant parts of it to you. Gonna leave this with all of the knowledge. Alright. Genocide. For the purpose of this statute, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, forcefully transferring children of the group to another group. I think that's fair fairly important. On to crimes against humanity. For the purpose of this statute, crimes against humanity means any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. Murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or forceful transfer of population, imprisonment, or other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law. Torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. Execution against any identifiable group of collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or gender as defined in paragraph 3, or forced disappearance of persons. The crime of apartheid, other inhumane acts of similar character, intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or mental or physical health. And then it has some definitions and explanations on how to further interpret words and phrases. A few kind of interesting and important ones, like extermination includes the intentional infliction of conditions of life, the deprivation of access to food and medicine calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population. Enslavement means to exercise of any of or all of the power attaching to the right of ownership over a person, and includes the exercise of such power in course of trafficking in persons, in particular women and children. Torture means the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused. This is an interesting one. Except that torture shall not include pain or suffering arising only from inherent or incidental to lawful sanctions, whatever that means. Forced pregnancy means the unlawful confinement of a woman forcefully made pregnant with the intent of affecting the ethnic composition of any population or carrying out other grave violations of international law. This definition shall not in any way be interpreted as affecting national laws relating to pregnancy. And they made a point of saying that. Crimes of apartheid means inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1 committed in the context of an institutionalized regime for systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. War crimes. The court shall have jurisdiction in respect of war crimes, in particular when committed as a part of a plan or policy or as part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. For the purpose of this statute, war crimes mean grave breach of the Geneva Conventions of the 12th of August 1949, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provision of the relevant Geneva Convention: willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, compelling a prisoner of war or other protective person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protective persons of the rights of a fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer or unlawful confinement, taking of hostages, other serious violations of laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict within the established framework of the international law, namely any of the following acts: intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population as such or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects, that is, objects which are not military objectives. Say that 5 times really fast. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, as long as they are entitled to the protection given to civilians or civilians objects under the international law of armed conflict. Intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects or widespread, long-term and severe damage to natural environment which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. Attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns, villages, dwellings or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives. Killing or wounding combatants who have laid down his arms or having no longer means of defense and surrendering at discretion. Making improper use of a flag of truce, of a flag of the military, insignia of a uniform of the enemy or of the United Nations, as well as the distinctive emblems of the Geneva Convention, resulting in death or serious personal injury. The transfer, directly or indirectly by the occupying power, of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, or the deportation or transfer of all or part of the population of the occupied territory within or or outside this territory. Intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not military objectives. Subjecting persons who are in the power of an adverse party to physical mutilation or other medical or scientific experiments of any kind which are neither justified by the medical, dental, or hospital treatment of the person concerned, nor carried out in his or her interest, and which cause death to or severely endanger the health of such person or persons. Killing or wounding treacherously individuals belonging to a hostile nation or army. Declaring that no quarter will be given. Now that's from an old term, which if a army would say no quarter will be given, that means that if someone from the other side were to surrender, no quarter means they won't give them a quarter to stay in, they won't hold them hostage and give them the basics to keep them alive. So pretty much if you surrender, you would just be shot dead. So it was an actual saying, but then as international laws and everything advance, it kind of has just become like a phrase which now just sort of translates to indiscriminately just killing. But anyway, moving on, destroying or seizing the enemy's property unless such destruction or siege be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. Declaring abolished, suspended, or inadmissible in a court of law the rights and actions of the nationals of the hostile party. Compelling the nationals of a hostile party to take part in operations of war directed against their own country, even if they were belligerent service before the commencement of the war. Pillaging a town or place even when taken by assault. Employing poisonous or poisoned weapons. Employing asphyxiating, poisonous, or other gases, and all analogous liquids, materials, or devices. Employing bullets which expand or flatten easily in the human body, such as bullets with hard envelopes which does not entirely cover the core or is pierced with incisions. Employing weapons, projectiles, and materials and methods of warfare which are of nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, or which are inherently indiscriminate in violation of international law of armed conflict, provided that such weapon, projectiles, and materials and other methods of warfare are the subject of a comprehensive prohibition. Committing outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating or degrading treatment. Committing rape, sexual slavery, enforcement, prosecution, forced slavery as defined in Article 7, Paragraph 2, F, enforced sterilization or other forms of sexual violence, also constituting a breach of the Geneva Convention. Utilizing the presence of a civilian or other protected persons to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations. Intentionally directing attacks against buildings, materials, medical units, and transport and personnel using the distinctive emblem of the Geneva Convention, conformity with international law. Intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, including willfully impeding relief supplies as provided under the Geneva Conventions. Conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15 into the national armed forces or using them to participate actively in hostilities. In the case of an armed conflict not of international character, serious violations of Article 3 common to the 4th Geneva Convention of 94, namely any of the following acts committed against the persons taking no active part in hostilities, including the member of armed forces who has laid down their arms, and those who placed hors de combat, which is French for out of combat, by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. Violence to life and persons, in particular murder of all kinds, mutilation, cruel treatment, and torture. Committing outrages upon persons' dignity, in particular humiliating or degrading treatment. Taking of hostages, the passing of sentences, and the carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by a regular constituted court, affording all de jure guarantees which are generally recognized as indispensable. Alright, I'll leave it there for...
What do you mean?